Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Fred Cudesar, and I am the third and last reporter for the topic Civil Engineering Code of Ethics and Obligation. My topic is specifically all about obligations of the civil engineer. So the previous two reporters have already discussed the engineering ethics, fundamental principles, and 6 fundamental canons. So now, just to recap, engineering ethics should be studied because it is important both in preventing grave consequences of faulty ethical reasoning and in giving meaning to engineers' endeavors. But it is complex, and it cannot be understood through casual observation. Second, fundamental principles, which it is stated in the Code of Ethics of the Philippine Institution of Civil Engineers that civil engineers uphold and advance the integrity, honor, and dignity of the civil engineering profession by following the principles. Lastly, the 6 fundamental canons, which talks about the central importance of exhibiting honesty and integrity. Also, it helps engineers to ensure the quality and standard services to give for all people's lives. So basically, these previous topics only discussed the ethical obligations and the proper behaviors and characteristics of a civil engineer. Now, in my report, I am going to present to you the obligations of the civil engineer, which have something one must do because of law, agreement, promise, and etc. So before proceeding, let us define what is obligation. So what is obligation? An obligation is a course of action that someone is required to take, whether it is legal or moral. Obligations are constraints, and they limit freedom. People who are under obligations may choose to freely act under obligations. So obligation simply means a commitment under the law. It is a duty or responsibility that someone is required to do what is imposed by a contract, promise, or law. When the said obligation is unable to perform, definitely there are potential penalties for the failure. So let us say a classroom who has rules and you are a student. With that being said, since you are a student in that classroom, you are obliged to obey the rules. If you are unable to do so, punishment or penalties will be served to you. This is same to a civil engineer who is obliged to perform the said obligations under the contract or law or promise. If the engineer or if the civil engineer is unable to perform the said obligations, there are certain penalties or punishment will be served to him. So as we all know, a civil engineer is a person who practices civil engineering, the application of planning, designing, constructing, maintaining, and operating infrastructure while protecting the public, environmental health, as well as improving existing infrastructure that may be or that may have been neglected. So to think, civil engineering practices are very massive. Civil engineers are capable of planning, designing, constructing, maintaining, and operating infrastructure. But do we know what should be the obligations of a civil engineer while doing these practices? Again, do we know what should be the obligations of a civil engineer while doing these practices? So now, let us know what are the obligations of the civil engineer. So what are the obligations of the civil engineer? So as mentioned lately, obligation is something one must do because of law, agreement, promise, and etc. So here are the lists of obligations of the civil engineer. First on the list is the civil engineer shall perform scope of the services as stated in Section 2 of the Republic Act number 544 or Civil Engineering Law, Article 1, Section 2. To all who doesn't know what is RA or Republic Act number 544, It is an act to regulate the practice of civil engineering in the Philippines. This act shall be known as the Civil Engineering Law. This was approved on the 17th day of July 1950 and was amended by Republic Act number 1582, specifically section 24 in RA number 544, which was also approved on the 16th day of June 1956. So in Article 1, Section 2 of RA 544 or Civil Engineering Law, it was said that the practice of civil engineering within the meaning and intent of this act shall embrace services in the form of consultation, design, preparation of plans, specifications, erection, installation, and supervisions of the construction of streets, bridges, highways, railroads, airports, hangars, port works, canals, rivers, and shore improvements, lighthouses and dry docks, buildings, fixed structures for irrigation, flood protection, drainage, water supply, and sewerage work, and also demolition of permanent structures and tunnel. So basically, this section entails about the scope of the services or the scope of services that should put into practice by a licensed engineer. As a civil engineer, there are services that you should take boundaries or services that you should not go beyond your profession. So this section discusses the scope of services just for a civil engineer. So furthermore, so let's say for example, I am a civil engineer and you are an architect. So I have a big project of building a 25-story condominium. So basically, as a civil engineer, I am obliged to present structural analysis, estimation, and etc. of the said project. But personally, I also know how to make architectural plans because I have studied it. The question is, am I obliged to do or should I do the architectural plans? Again, am I obliged to do or should I do the architectural plans? Well, the answer is no. Architectural plans are responsibilities of an architect. He is responsible of designing the building. Since I am the civil engineer, I should just do my task as a civil engineer, which is to present structural analysis, estimating, and etc. I must be responsible of not crossing my limitations as a civil engineer. And also, in section 1, the enumeration of any work shall not be construed as excluding any other work requiring civil engineering knowledge and application. So it means what was not mentioned, the works, what were not mentioned that are under the works of civil engineer are still covered as long as the works fall under the engineering profession. So the second obligation is that the civil engineer shall exercise reasonable skill, care, and diligence in the performance of his obligations. So we all know that civil engineering is an important and learned profession. As a civil engineer, you're expected to exhibit the highest standards of obligation, such as exercising unquestionable and reasonable performance. So if you are a civil engineer, you should have an above average skill about your profession because the safety of the project relies with you and your skills. Moreover, as an engineer, every time you have a project or everything that you do, you should exert A+ effort. You have the responsibility to perfect the project or free from errors because even a single error can bring hazard or danger to the whole project. Therefore, you should be diligent and careful. So the third obligation is that the civil engineer shall act independently and as required by the contract, perform with the necessary skills and professional judgment when required to certify, decide, or exercise discretion between the client and a third party with whom the client has a contract. It simply means that a civil engineer should act professional at all times, whether in dealing with the client or a third party with whom the client has a contract. There must be boundaries and limitations on how a civil engineer act or perform to the client, because sometimes there are professionals who don't know how to take boundaries, which lead to chaos or misunderstanding between two parties. So it is a must to act professionally as a civil engineer at all times. On the other hand, talking about performing with necessary skills and professional judgment, it simply implies that a civil engineer should not be biased or inconsiderate in terms of the client's suggestions. There are instances that a civil engineer doesn't have an ear for the suggestions of the client, or a civil engineer is biased on all his judgments. That should not be exercised by a civil engineer. Instead, a civil engineer should oblige to listen and accept suggestions from the client. Fourth obligation, the civil engineer is authorized to act as the client's faithful agent when required, but only as implied in Section 2 or implied in the contract adopted for the project. Basically, in many professions, it is an obligation to be 100% committed to a certain project, especially to the client. To civil engineers, once you take a project, you are responsible for the whole services you are tasked to do. And as what I've said, throughout the process, the relationship between a civil engineer and the client should be tight. A civil engineer should always keep in touch to the client professionally. Whatever the problems and changes regarding the project, the civil engineer should report these problems and changes to the client as a sign of faithfulness. So the fifth obligation is when aware of any matters which will change or has changed the scope of the services, the civil engineer shall give written notice to the client containing particulars of the change. So as what I've said a while ago, whatever the problems and changes regarding the project, the civil engineer should report these to the client. A civil engineer must be accountable of telling what has been happening to the project, detail by detail. As we all know, it is one of the ethics of a civil engineer to be honest, or honesty, and that should be applied always. Besides, it is the right of the client to be updated of what is happening about the project. The sixth obligation is for specified stage services. The civil engineer shall not initiate or proceed with any subsequent stage of the services without the approval of the client. So prior in taking or proceeding with any subsequent stage of the services, a civil engineer should first ask approval to the client. It would be disrespectful if a civil engineer would not approach the client before taking a step. So asking for approval to the client first before proceeding should always be done by a civil engineer so that the client can also monitor the progress somehow. So, seventh obligation is when required, the civil engineer shall direct and cooperate with all other professionals and integrate their work where applicable into that being undertaken by the civil engineer and other professions, but shall not be professionally liable for their work. Basically, this talks about teamwork. In big projects like building a hotel, there are many professions working on it. We have civil engineer, architecture, electrical engineer, and etc. As a civil engineer, you are involved in a project design and construction processes as well as planning, and is responsible to team up with a lot of people to designate the assigned works. So engineers shall perform services only in areas of their competence. Engineers are not accounted and be judged by the quality of their acquaintances' works. So, eighth obligation, the civil engineer may recommend specialty suppliers and or contractors to design and execute certain parts of the works, in which case the civil engineer shall coordinate the design of such part or parts with the overall design of the works, but he or she shall be relieved of all responsibility for the design, manufacture, installation, and performance of any such part of or parts of works. So being a civil engineer, you should have to participate in managing, designing, developing, creating, and maintaining construction projects. However, engineers shall perform services only in the areas of their competence. In result, he or she shall be relieved of all responsibilities that he or she is not part of. Engineers shall undertake assignments only when qualified by education. So the last obligation is the civil engineer shall notify the client of any interest the civil engineer has which significantly conflict with the interests of the client under the contract. So engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Civil engineer shall disclose all known or potential conflicts of interest that could influence or appear to influence their judgment or their quality of their services, in order for them not to compromise the quality of their works. So moreover, civil engineers are obliged to notify their client with their interest. They should be explicit on what they want to put out or do in order to avoid conflict with the interest of the client. It should be made clear that the transaction between the client and the civil engineer is inclined with whatever was written on the contract before signing it. If ever the civil engineer has some troubles within what was in the contract, he or she may consult it to the client to fix that matter and settle it. So the purpose of it really is to avoid conflict even before the project or the transaction has started. So I think that ends my report. So I hope you have learned something. So thank you for listening and have a good day.